Hey, welcome everyone. This is a show that explores various aspects of addiction, potentially focusing on personal stories of recovery, scientific perspectives, societal impacts, or related topics. This podcast often features discussions with experts, individuals in recovery, therapists, and advocates to offer insights and support to those affected by addiction or seeking more information about it. Welcome to another episode of The Other Side of Addiction. I am your host, Al Richards, and today we're going to be talking about understanding pornography addiction and betrayal trauma with our guest, Stephen. And is it Croshaw? Am I saying that right, Stephen? Croshaw?
That's correct. Yeah. That's
Awesome.
correct.
Well,
Stephen Croshaw.
Stephen, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be with us. And, really a huge thank you for being so vulnerable and opening up about such. Oh my gosh, that's a strong topic, right? We have guests that come on the show that, talk about their drug addiction and their alcoholism and being unsheltered and things like that. However, when it comes to something like a porn addiction, my gosh, it's like a voodoo, right? Especially in the state of Utah. I mean, it's things that people don't think that's happening here, and it is. So I tell you what, it takes a huge person to step up to the plate and share a little bit about their story. So thank you so much for being willing to do this. And I want to say also thank you to Heidi from making lemons out of lemonade or making lemonade out of lemons. So Heidi is an awesome lady. I've been a guest on her show like you have, and I love Heidi to death. She's an amazing woman. So gosh, Steve, when we was talking here right before the show, I mean, when you said that you really felt like your addiction started at age 6, that is like young.
Yeah, that's really young. I My first exposure to pornography was age 6, and I wonder for and I don't know when I crossed the threshold and really would fit a description of addiction. I know from the very beginning that once I was exposed to pornography, I was drawn to it. And at an early age of 6 years old, I had no understanding of really what it was. I didn't have an understanding of sexuality in general. I didn't. I discovered the pornography innocently. It was not something that was introduced to me by a friend. I discovered or found a magazine in my brother's chest of drawers. My brother is 9 years older, so he being 15, having a pornographic magazine in his chest of drawers. And I was just, as a little person will do, I'm going to just do whatever searches throughout the house. What can I find?
Right.
And when I found the magazine, I was, of course, I looked at the cover. I was intrigued, and this was a long time ago. This is 1958. So pornography in 1958 is very tame in comparison to the pornography that's on the internet today, but it was certainly something that was very intriguing and even euphoric. The experience I would describe as euphoric. I was just really little, took the magazine to my room, looked at it, and then in my innocence as a little boy, I knew it was wrong, and so I took the magazine to my mother and gave it to her. Don't recall anything beyond that, but that was my first experience with pornography. My As I have worked my own recovery and worked with many hundreds, even thousands of other people working recovery from sexual addiction, I've heard lots and lots of stories of the first introductions to pornography or masturbation or both. And the ages range. I think the youngest is 5. And his story is pretty amazing. Um, of his feelings, he described as magical and mystical. It went into a garage that had pornographic images all over the garage of a neighbor's house, and it was just kind of a magical experience for him. And so that first exposure to pornography is most generally remembered in some vivid detail by people that I speak to about their experiences of understanding their progression and using porn and discovering masturbation, and then where it goes from there. So yeah, that's the way my story started. Um, I being so young, I didn't really know how to gain access except for finding pornography, and generally it was in my brother's stuff, and so I would occasionally find something. I did when I later, a little bit later on in my early life, I discovered that maybe I could hide some away, so I would do that, which was common. I didn't discover masturbation until I was about 12, and I was just introduced to the idea, not shown how to do it, but introduced to the idea by a friend. And so after I discovered pornography and then added masturbation to it, then I think that's when I really began to be heading down the threshold of addiction.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because there are many who debate. There's a lot of debate, and there are many who essentially say that using pornography, yes, it can become a habit. Yes, it can become a compulsion, but will minimize the possibility that it could become a true addiction. I'm not in that camp. I'm in the camp that pornography, that using pornography and then combining that with masturbation and doing it on a regular basis actually becomes a behavioral addiction, and I would classify it as an addiction of the highest order. It's extraordinarily difficult to stop the behavior. In fact, I know many, many men who I work recovery with that have multiple addictions that would include substances, alcohol, drugs, tobacco, um, some even with a gambling addiction, that say that they have years of sobriety from substance addictions, alcohol, tobacco, drugs, even, but cannot stop the use of pornography, can't
Hmm.
stop the acting out behaviors that go beyond that. One of the things that's really challenging with with sexual addiction is we are all sexual beings, and we have the capabilities of acting on sexual promptings anywhere, anytime. I mean, obviously there's social norms, but many people obviously get outside those social norms really fast and get into voyeurism or exhibitionism. That doesn't suggest that everybody goes that far in or that far down the pathway towards prostitutes, and other illicit sexual behaviors. But one of the big challenges with any addiction is it wants more. The problem with sexual addiction is it doesn't just want more, it wants different. So, what is different? And different gets darker
Hmm.
and more dangerous. And so, in my case, I had, pornography, masturbation was really my acting out choice until high school. And then I got involved with really inappropriate relationships with some girls in high school. And that actually kind of slowed down my porn use, masturbation. But when after uh, after I got a little bit older, into my late teens, I recognized that I really need to stop this stuff because I would like to find the right girl and marry a girl and not be plagued with this strong compulsion to act out with pornography and masturbation and seeking sexual pleasures in various ways. So anyway, I stopped, thought I'd stopped, and I honestly thought that I had stopped for good, and that I met a girl she's my wife today. We've been married for 51 years, which is a miracle based upon my story.
Right.
So I thought that I stopped for a time. I confessed, as many within the religious community that I am a part of, confessed to my church leader, which I had done more than once. But anyway, so in preparation for marriage, thought that I was good to go. I didn't tell my fiance wife to be anything about my past behaviors because I thought that I'd stopped, and frankly, I was kind of advised that maybe I didn't need to do that, which is incorrect advice, by the way. So I wouldn't advise anyone to go into a relationship where there isn't 100% honesty. But
Yeah.
anyway, I wasn't. married thinking that that would change my desire to act out sexually outside the marriage. So I married, we married, and it wasn't very long. I would say a couple of 3 months, I was back to porn, masturbating, hiding it, not telling anyone. And so my business responsibilities, my job um, was a traveling job. So I traveled and I traveled alone, be gone for several days at a time. And so that gave me opportunities to act out secretly a lot. And as I mentioned before, the addiction or the compulsion that I identify as an addiction doesn't just want more, it's wanting different. At some time during that acting out period, I discovered adult establishments, strip clubs is a better description. And by the time so that behavior continued, and I hid that behavior, adult establishments, along with porn and masturbation, for many years. So I lived a very duplicitous life, and I call that posing. The double life. I was a businessman. I had successful business. I was a family man. I had children. I had an incredible wife. Had responsibilities in my church, and so here I am traveling, living this double life, and eventually that led on to all the way to prostitution. So here I'm in the situation of representing myself as a solid family man, and I was not. When I was traveling, I was not. When I was home, I frankly lived a life that I represented on the outside, but I wasn't the same on the inside that I was on the outside. And
You
that's
know,
one of the. Go
well,
ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think a lot of people do that, right? I mean, we're one way with family, and then especially because we do have that freedom when we travel. Who's going to know, right? Because we're in an area where no one knows us, and I
Sure.
think that happens quite often.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
Yeah,
I mean, and the use of pornography and masturbation is relatively easily hidden unless somebody wants to be kind of dumb how they use and put themselves in really vulnerable situations. Young people, children that really, they'll get on the internet and they'll be using the computer, not realizing that all the history's there, and get discovered by their parents or get discovered using, and they get their hands slapped and don't do this kind of thing. But most generally, it doesn't go beyond that for a child.
yeah.
In getting help for the for the behavior, which is really sad. And so, just to give a little, I'll just kind of tell a little bit about myself. I've been working my recovery for 18 years, honest, in a very honest way. My sobriety date is actually 2005, August of 2005. And since then, I've not acted out with porn or masturbation or prostitutes or adult establishments. So during that period of time, I've worked with literally hundreds and hundreds of people um, that want to change their lives, that want to stop the behavior and live in recovery. And so uh, during this 18-year period, I've had a lot of experience with parents trying to help children, a lot of experience with single adult men trying to stop, with married men that are my age that have lived a double life like I have. I see many who have experienced the divorce as a result, that have lost their families, have lost their jobs, in a couple of instances have lost their lives, taken their own lives. And so it's,
Hmm.
I mean, the downside of this behavior is dramatic and traumatic, very, very much so. So just back to my story, I at age 35, I couldn't live the double life anymore. It was such a heavy weight to carry that I came forward and told my wife and told others that needed to know, experienced rather serious consequences in from several aspects of my life. But my wife stayed with me as I confessed acting out with prostitutes. That's a really hard thing. And you mentioned trauma, betrayal trauma. At that time, when I told my wife, she knew nothing of my double life. So here we are in our 30s. We had 5 children at that time, and I had a business, I had employees, and when I had church responsibilities, I had children, and this was a this was a hard impact situation. And I told my wife, just totally cold turkey, without a therapist or anyone else. I just couldn't carry the weight any longer. So I went through my whole history with her, and it was traumatizing for her. She didn't know that. I didn't know that, but it was extraordinarily difficult for her to handle. And it's a miracle that she was able to deal with it and without help. To a large degree, she dealt with it without help.
Holy
Our
cow.
families knew. Our families knew, and one friend, one woman friend, basically saved her. That she confided in. So trauma that women, mostly women, there are some men that are betrayed in the relationships, but it's primarily men that betray women. Don't they don't deserve the experience of being traumatized by betrayal. They didn't ask for it in most cases by their own behaviors, but yet they experience a very serious emotional and physical response to being betrayed, having the trust betrayed in the relationship. And that certainly happened in our relationship. So my wife just she just soldiered through, frankly, by herself. My commitment was real and honest. I wanted to stop. And so I did. I stopped. And there, as I mentioned, there were consequences in several parts of my life, in church and some business consequences. But I I didn't the idea of a that I was dealing with an addiction was never introduced to me at that time. So this would have been in the mid 80s. Um, I didn't know anything of addiction, nor did anyone else that I spoke to. I just stopped cold turkey, and we went on with our lives. And I did for 3 years stop the behavior totally. No porn, no masturbation, none of the other activities, adult establishments, prostitutes, even though I continued in my same business ventures, traveling. But about 3 years down the line, I relaxed a little bit, looked at some pornography in a hotel room, and that sent me back on the path, and down I went. So I was back on the path, and eventually, and I didn't tell anybody that I relapsed. That I consider a relapse, acting out, not telling anybody, lying about it. So I relapsed, and that sent me back down the pathway, and I lived that double life again for another 10 years, for another 7 years. So it was like 10 years from the time that I came forward. Three
Wow.
abstinent and seven more hiding. And then the story repeated itself. It was exactly the same thing. I came forward because of the weight and the consequences of what I was doing. I did not get caught. I just came forward.
Yeah. So,
So
so can I stop you, just pause you for just a second, Stephen? When, after the 3 years and it started again, did it come back even stronger? Because I know, people who have battled the drugs and alcohol, right? And they've been in sobriety for a certain amount of time. And then for one reason or another, maybe they relax just like what you said that you did, and they go back into it thinking, okay, well, I could probably take one more hit of heroin and I'll be okay because I've been clean, or I can take another drink, whatever it may be. And it seems like it comes back so strong, and a lot of them end up losing their life, right? Because they're wanting that feeling, that rush again, and then they end up taking more than what is really needed, and they end up overdosing or alcohol poisoning or whatever it may be. Did you find that same when it came to that?
it's similar. It's
Okay.
not exactly the same, but what you described is common, uh, especially in certain drugs that have the capability of killing you when you overdose on them. And to some degree, alcohol is the same. What happened in my case is that I recognized that. I mean, I had the euphoric experience. I didn't want to do that, quote unquote. Like I always considered this behavior unwanted sexual behavior, and because I would do it, but I didn't want the consequences. I didn't want the negative feelings associated with it. So it was like this unwanted behavior, but yet I would go back to it. What happened the second time and the third time for me was very, very quickly, I was back to prostitutes. The first time, it took me from the time that I was a child to get to prostitutes into my mid 30s.
Right.
But the second time, I was back to prostitutes fast. I mean, it was probably within just a matter of a couple of months. I'd gone from porn in the hotel room all the way back to prostitutes. My behavior didn't progress beyond prostitution. It was never exhibitionism or voyeurism into some of those dangerous areas. Not that that prostitution isn't dangerous; it's very dangerous, but it doesn't hold the same weight of danger as voyeurism and um, exhibitionism when it comes to legal consequences. And hurting other people consequences. Obviously, acting out with a prostitute is hurting people badly, but there's a real innocence in hurting someone through voyeurism or exhibitionism. Many people who are totally innocent are really damaged in those kinds of interactions. So it
Yeah.
gets more dangerous, especially when it goes to young people. And gratefully, my addiction didn't go young. But a lot of guys that deal with porn problems and other escalating behaviors end up going young, and that's when they really get in trouble. Those are the guys on the news.
Yeah.
But there's my story is basically I went back into the behavior in that 10-year period. I came forward again, clean for 3 years. Same thing happened again, except I had changed my lifestyle a little bit. So the second time I came forward, the idea of addiction was introduced to me. And that is an important part of my story. Truly, one of the most important part of my stories really began at that point when the idea of addiction was introduced to me. So the first time through, nothing ever thought of in relationship to addiction, even presented to me as the idea. Second time around, now I'm in the 1990s, and the idea of dealing with an addiction was introduced to me by a therapist, and I refused even the possibility that I was dealing with an addiction. I was introduced and suggested that I go to some 12-step meetings, and I actually went to 4 12-step SA meetings, Sexaholics Anonymous, which is really a great program, by the way. 12-step program of Sexaholics Anonymous. I went for 4 meetings, and I felt so uncomfortable. Like, I'm not one of these guys. I'm not an addict, even though this therapist had suggested it. And so I rejected the possibility that I was dealing with an addiction. And that rejection of that possibility that I was dealing with an addiction it really kind of limited me on what work I was willing to do in recovery. That's so common. I think it's common for every addiction,
Yeah. Yeah.
whether it's drugs, alcohol, or behavioral addiction. This admitting, which is step one, the unmanageability of the behavior. This admitting that I just couldn't see it for me. Well, let's just fast forward. So the second time I came forward, the same thing happened. 3 years sober, went back to the behavior, hit it. Then on August 25th, 2005, I was arrested for picking up a prostitute. That was a life-changing experience for me because it was so profound in how dramatic it was, how out of control my life was. I mean, it was out of control anyway. Here I was acting out with prostitutes and very in dangerous situations, but I had never been quote unquote caught. Now I'm caught, and it gives me a chance to really say, where are you? And I will say that I believe, a spiritual experience in that event. Um, I, I believe I did. I think back on it, and I think that really happened. But it seems to me that I saw myself from above, looking at myself, leaning up a car against the car I had, and I was handcuffed, and the police were around me. It's as though I saw myself in that situation. And I don't want to go too spiritual on it here, but that was profound for me. It was like, holy smoke, who are you?
Right.
And so And the police officers did a great job of shaming me. I mean, they just shamed the heck out of me. Like, I think we're going to arrest you. I think we'll impound your car. I think we'll call your wife because you won't have a way home. Is that all right with you, sir? And so they kind of went down that pathway and took different approaches to it. There was evidence of my church affiliations in my wallet, and that gave them incredible opportunities. So you can imagine how deep I was. I mean,
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
that that is that's serious double life business right there. And so I didn't tell anyone. I went to an attorney. The attorney said, "Did you admit guilt?" I said, "No." He said, "I'll get you off. They can't prove it if you didn't." Because I wasn't in the act. I just had picked up a girl that they were
Yeah.
watching. So it was her word against mine. The attorney said, "Oh, I'll get you off." And he was true. I never heard another word about it. I paid him the money and I was off. They didn't ever pursue me. Um, but 2 weeks later, about 2.5 weeks later, I had become so incredibly fearful that I was going to be discovered that it was just killing me. I couldn't continue.
Hmm.
And so I finally came forward. I decided in the middle of the night, I had another experience that I consider very spiritual. And that was, I considered what I started to ask myself if I believed in God, because I tried to convince myself that I didn't, which I thought would relieve the pain, which was intense, the fear of being caught. And I could not convince myself that I wasn't a believer. So when I couldn't convince myself that I wasn't a believer, then I said, "Who am I fooling here? God knows me and he knows. And so who am I fooling if he knows?" So I finally came to myself and said, I'll be honest. So I told my wife the next morning. I told my church leader the next morning. 2 weeks later, I was out of my church. I was basically headed down, my wife was headed down the pathway of divorce, and which she had every right to be, every justification to head down that road. So if we look at my story, you got to see my wife going through this whole story with me, my children going through this whole
Of
story with
course.
me,
Yeah.
and their trauma. And we could take podcast after podcast on this. How does it affect a woman that's a spouse that's been betrayed and had trust broken so many times, that's been gaslighted? How does this affect children who weren't connected to their dad? And so they were kind of wondering, why doesn't my dad pay more attention to me? And so I was never inappropriate with my children. And frankly, I was never personally, in my interactions with my wife, inappropriate with her either. But I had this duplicitous life. When I say inappropriate sexually with her.
Right. Right.
Um, so anyway, that's my story of addiction, kind of where it went. But it wasn't until the third time that I came to my senses and said, "Okay, I'll acknowledge addiction." And the therapist I got was a great therapist, and that isn't easy to do. Find a really, really good therapist. And so, in this message for me, it's like, don't just be willy nilly thinking you can find a therapist easily that really knows the challenges that you face, and that is going to be a good match for your personality and your circumstances. But I was very fortunate to find a therapist that I was referred to, who was extraordinarily good, knew sexual addiction extraordinarily well. That was his practice. And frankly, I credit him with being influential in helping my wife bridge the gap. He asked her in a meeting, he said, "Can you stay with him if he's in recovery?" You can imagine what her response was to that. Like, like, what is recovery? This
Yeah.
guy,
Right.
he lies to me. He's lied to me for decades. He's betrayed me over and over again. I trusted him after he came forward once and then twice. Anyway, it was a traumatic thing for her to even be asked that question.
Well, and even that trust, right? So if you were still traveling at that time, I mean, what was going through her mind every time you walked out that door to go on a business trip, right? Because I'm sure all that was playing,
Yeah, yeah,
rewinding in her head, you know?
yeah, precisely. All of that was going around and around.
Yeah.
So but every part had to be on the table with me at that point, and that was, okay, what are you going to do to commit yourself to recovery, Stephen? I mean, that's the question I'm asking myself. My wife, of course, was beyond that question. It was like, what am I, where am I going to find it? The proper way to go through in a divorce. And I had 7 kids at this time, and 5 of them were married. So I'm an adult man, in my 50s, businessman. So anyway, um, I did find a great therapist. He did ask the question of my wife. He did say to her something that was very interesting. Can you stay with him as if he's in recovery? And of course, her response was, as we talked, how could I ever know? And he said, you'll know. He said, you'll know because you're going to participate in this work of recovery. And so you know what recovery looks like, what it talks like, how it acts, what it sounds like. And so with a really good therapist and then a great 12-step group, I found a good Sexaholics Anonymous 12-step group in Salt Lake, which was like 60 miles away from my home. And I found a great therapist, or excuse me, a great sponsor who was about my age. His story was just like mine, but he had 6 years of sobriety when I met him, and he had a smile on his face, and he had this like hopeful presence about him. And I thought, oh man, I need to get to know this guy. How did he possibly do that? And he helped me work through the steps, and he was a good role model. And as I became familiar with his story, and he helped me understand my story. I mean, he told me a few things that really no one else could have said to me. If my wife had said some of the things he said to me, I would have thought she was totally shaming me. But a good sponsor can say things because they've experienced it and they understand it from their own experience. And that's one of the amazing things about working with a sponsor in a good 12-step program. And the alcoholics say this profoundly. They say the best person to help an alcoholic in recovery is another alcoholic in
Of
recovery.
course. Yeah.
And so that's the way it is with sexual addiction. It's that way, I think, with any addiction.
Yeah.
I think I got more help from a qualified, I mean, more help from a sponsor than I did even from a really qualified therapist, because that person that I worked with had been on the pathway. I trusted him implicitly, and he was not there to carry me. He was just there to show me, and I was just really grateful for that. So anyway, that's I did at that time do everything that I knew what to do. I actually got off the road. My boundaries became rather profound. I no longer travel by myself. I don't watch TV by myself. I never take my phone into the bathroom. I have these boundaries that I will not break. That where I don't go to water parks. I don't go to places that could potentially have any type of danger associated with them for exposure that I don't have people with me. I have to make a commitment to be present and honest in the moment. We all know what recovery takes, and that is that I can't stay inside my head. I've got to be willing to talk about what I do, what I feel. I've got to be able to surrender these negative emotions before they become something that I feel like I've got to medicate in a negative way. I mean, this is all the stuff that any person that's dealing with addiction that is honest about it learns as they go through the process of working recovery. It's all the same for sexual addiction, as I believe,
Yeah.
as it is for
Yeah.
other addictions. But I can tell you that I have an incredible appreciation for Alcoholics Anonymous, for the literature in Alcoholics Anonymous, for the big book, for the 12 and 12. I mean, they are foundational, and where God-centered recovery is really, really presented in the right way. It's no matter what your religious affiliation is, no matter where you are in your belief of God, it is what it is. We all have a different understanding of God, and we all have our own, that whatever that understanding is where we start.
Yeah.
But the
Yeah.
but but the alcoholics are not bashful. I mean, they're not bashful about that in the least. It's like on every page of the big book. And so that is where I really felt like I learned more about surrender, surrendering to God, the power greater than myself, than in any time previous to that in any of my religious affiliation. Not to suggest that those things are not there in the doctrine of the scriptures, the Bible, etc. It is there, but it's not, it doesn't seem to be as simple and concise as it is within the simple 12 steps. Here's 12 steps. Unmanageability, belief in God, whatever that belief and understanding is, it's your own, and then a willingness to surrender to that, to my personal understanding of that higher power. And for me, that higher power is God. I have an
Yeah.
understanding of God, and with that understanding is what I go on, and it frankly has grown in recovery. My whole understanding and perspective of how I see God, how I believe I relate to God, how He relates to me, has grown incredibly in my work of recovery, in my efforts of recovery. So it's not just 12 step, and it's not just therapists. There's a there's a lot that has to do with education, um, but it all starts with willingness. And if there's any degree of hesitation or an unwillingness to be involved in the work, or an unwillingness to be completely honest, then basically those negative parts of dishonesty, if there's any of that, and if there's any hesitation on willingness, it will just delay recovery.
Yeah. Well, and it has a chance of putting its claws back in you again, right? And pulling you
Yeah.
back down that same hole.
Well, that chance is always there. That's why we learn that we surrender daily. I mean, and
Yeah.
we it's
Yeah.
almost this constant thing, because a very interesting thing. This is said in the White Book of alcohol of Sexaholics Anonymous. It says that the compulsion will subside with sobriety, but the temptation will always be there. And I think that's but coming back to sexual addiction as compared to, say, alcoholism or drugs, the use of drugs or tobacco. Um, Sexual addiction has a component that isn't with those behavioral, that's behavioral, that isn't with the substance addictions. It is that as sexual beings, I have the capability of acting out sexually and being triggered sexually at all times, anywhere. And so if I have a phone in my hand, I have a phone in my hand, and it's in my pocket, and it has access to the drug of my choice at any time. Incredible access to triggering images, triggering voices, and triggering connections. If that's with me all the time, it presents a challenge that I think is a little bit different. I would never want to ask an alcoholic to carry a fifth of whiskey around with them all the time. That
Yeah.
would be unfair. But yet I can't get along without my phone. I don't think I can anyway. In reality, I probably could, but I choose not to. But it's a device that I can use inappropriately at any time, and not just my phone, but my computer. And then I've got my body with me all the time, and my memory with me all the time. And how easy is it to go back to simply having some kind of fantasy and choosing to masturbate? Well, any form of sex with anyone other than any form of sex with myself, or acting out with pornography or another person that's not my wife, is going to send me down a pathway of this acting on lust, where I'm back on the pathway. I guess I should say I'm in the ditch now, associated with uh, uh, my system now demanding more of the same thing that gives me that heavy dopamine hit. So
Yeah.
if we go into the science of it, certain drugs are going to give me a lot higher dopamine hit than acting out sexually, but an orgasm is a very high dopamine hit, and it produces not it and it produces also bonding chemicals. So if I'm bonding to things that are unreal, and I'm getting dopamine hits to things that are unreal, that are basically all make believe, pornography being the case, and then I'm having sex with myself, the result of that is I it breaks the connection that I have with reality. And so my connection with other people, especially those that I should be really connected to, like my wife and my children and my close friends, now suddenly those are interrupted because I've gone and I've pursued counterfeits. And those counterfeits, oftentimes, if they're depending on a person's belief system, but if the belief system is those are wrong behaviors, then I hide them, and then I feel the shame of that, and that becomes part of the compulsion to go back to the behavior to medicate. There's a very interesting, I don't know if this is in other recovery literature, but in the recovery literature that I use, especially the white book, Sexaholics Anonymous, it says the only way to be free of it was to do it. Well, that's a real serious predicament to be in. The only way to be free of it is to do it. So I call it the crap trade. Um, so the sexually acting out moment might be, it could be 10 minutes, it could be 10 hours, depending on how isolated I can make myself to act out, or I can, what
Right.
kind of a situation. But then after that period of acting out, there's this huge letdown. It's feelings of shame, anger towards oneself, if my belief system says this is wrong. And so I'll carry the weight of that negativity with me all the time until the next time I act out. Then I get that dopamine hit, I get the euphoria associated with the behavior, and then that ends. And then for days, for hours, days, even months, I carry that negativity about myself and about my abilities to deal with life in a healthy way. That's a crap trade.
Oh
It's
yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's like insanity. And
It's
so,
it's a hamster wheel, right? Because
yeah,
I watched I watched that happen as well. Because that guilt continues and it just continues to build, and the
yeah,
shame does the
yeah,
same thing, right? You're it's almost like you're building an onion, right? You just keep putting the layers on one right after another, and it just gets to where it's so big. That's a lot to carry around.
yeah. It's a lot to carry around, and the only way to be free of it is to do it. And then you add another layer of shame to that onion, whatever it is. And then
Yeah.
you carry more of that. And then in the case of sexual addiction, like I was, then you get busted. It's like the whole world explodes. Truly, the world explodes. Everything that's important to me, my wife, my family, my job, my church, my any self-esteem, any how do I represent myself to other people now that thought that I was this, but no, I'm this. I mean, it gets a little bit complicated. And
Yeah, I
so
can imagine.
it and I experienced that to some degree, but I also would suggest that my fear of people rejecting me once they really knew me was different than the reality. The reality was once I got honest and was truly working recovery, and then I made my story public at some time down the line, which was 3 years later, I discovered that people, hey, they had to process it, but I was not rejected. I don't think I have never felt generally rejected ever. I've felt generally accepted. But it's a little bit different in sexual addiction than it is in certain addictions like alcohol. I think it's a little easier to cheer for the recovering alcoholic than it is the recovering sex addict, because
Hmm.
a lot of times people, when they hear sexual addiction, they think about the guy that they just heard on the news that raped somebody, or that was voyeuristic and got caught in voyeurism, or an exhibitionist, or those are the people that we relate to sexual addiction. Well, those are the extreme cases, not realizing that in most households there is a sex addict. This addiction touches literally every family. I mean, there may not be a sex addict in your house, but I can tell you that there is in your neighborhood. I can tell you that there is in your family. That might be a relatively close relative, but somebody has a compulsion to use pornography and masturbate that's hiding it that you don't know. And their compulsion is truly an addiction. They're using it to medicate. They're going back to it in spite of negative consequences. Their behaviors are escalating, getting more out of control, and they're everywhere. And the percentage of people that are users when it comes to porn is huge. It's totally huge.
It's like we've said in the other type the addiction with the drugs and alcohol, right? And it sounds like it's the exact same thing with this, Stephen. It doesn't discriminate, right? It's not a certain type of individual that falls into that, right? It affects everyone. It doesn't discriminate. And I mean, you know, I've had people who've been on the show, and I've also talked to individuals who off to the side who are in the sex trade, right? and they've shared with me the type of clients that come through. And you're just sitting there scratching your head going, oh my gosh, are you serious? Because it's almost like every walk of life that goes through
Oh,
there.
sure. It's young, it's old, it's in between. It's people who are extraordinarily successful on the outside. I mean that have been financially successful, have been in leadership positions, successful. I mean, the list goes on. It's in
Yeah.
yes, it's not gonna and in the 12-step groups that I'm in, I mean, the only thing that really brings us together is our addiction. I mean, that's the only thing that brings us because we're all so different. Um, and that's pretty common with addiction when you go in. I think I'm not a regular at AA meetings. And one of the things about by the way, I'll just say a little bit more about the meetings that I attend now actually are the meetings that we have started. They're called SAL 12 step. And we have SAL 12 step meetings for recovery from both sexual addiction and betrayal trauma. We use the 12 steps on both sides of that. But in our meetings, they're all gender specific. Men don't meet with men and women don't meet in the same meetings, period.
Right, right.
So and that's for safety. It doesn't mean that some men don't experience trauma as a result of betrayal at the hands of their wife. That's the by far the minority, but but that usually is not. It's usually the other way around, men betraying their wives. In the case of women, there's more women that are dealing with compulsion to act out sexually than we realize, and there's a great fear coming forward because there's a lot of shame associated with it. But most of the women really deal to a large degree with a love addiction, where they're seeking a connection and they're not as visual as a man. But and that's why romantic novels, it's really mommy porn, 50 Shades of Grey, or the various novels that women are drawn to. And there's a great book. I'll refer to this book as one that is terrific. It's addiction in general, but it has quite a focus on sexual addiction. It's called Dopamine Nation. I recommend it to anyone. It's by Anna Lemke. Dopamine Nation, and she talks about her own addiction. She's a psychiatrist, so she's an MD psychiatrist. She's head of the addiction department at Stanford University. And so here's a woman that you would think would be like, she's going to know better. She got addicted to pornographic novels and could not stop. And it got deeper and deeper where she was and where she was essentially giving herself over time wise to these novels. It was interrupting her life, interrupting her sleep, interrupting her business interactions and her teaching assignments. So she tells her story in bits and pieces throughout the book. But she talks about radical honesty as being critical. She talks about balance. She talks about the science of what happens in our brain and why abstinence is absolutely critical. You can't heal from addiction if you're going to. It's not something that there can be 1 foot in, 1 foot out, which I completely believe.
Yeah.
You cannot be a periodic with addiction. At least I've never found it to be that case in my own life, and I've never found it to be that case with people that I work with. You can claim to be a periodic and be okay, but it
Mm.
screws life up. And it you just in the case of alcoholics, most of them say, I just, I have to be teetotal away from alcohol. I don't have any room. Well, it's the same way with sex, same way with sex
Yeah.
addiction. And it's really hard. It's really hard because we're sexual beings and there are everywhere you go, there's going to be some presentation of something that's sexualized. You walk through the mall, you walk to the grocery store, you're vulnerable to having some kind of a sexual triggering image, whether wherever it is. We all know that. So then those have to be surrendered, and got to be careful not to go to shame and say, what's the matter with me? Why do I feel this way? So it's just it's a challenge. I need to say a little bit more about trauma. Even though you would think a person, oftentimes the feeling is that a person who's been traumatized believes that their healing will occur when the person that has betrayed them and lied to them and been deceitful and caused that trauma. Some people think, well, if that person that betrayed me will just get into recovery and I can begin to trust again, that I'll heal. That's not true. A woman who's been traumatized has to work her own recovery.
Yeah.
Many women choose the divorce pathway, and justified certainly to do that, will not work their recovery. And sadly, they'll end up with another person very much like the one they just divorced.
Yeah, they bring it back into their life.
They bring it back and innocently sometimes, but they
Yes.
just seem to find their way back to the same problem because they didn't work their recovery. And so, and it's this isn't an event and then all of a sudden you're good to go. This is a process, and it's the process, whether it's trauma or whether it's addiction. There's a pathway for both, and they both have to be worked continuously. And for me, there isn't a destination of I've arrived, now I'll go back to real life. Well, what is real life?
Yeah.
What is real life? Is real life living free from this behavior? And is there a willingness on my part to constantly live this one day at a time mentality where I'm willing to surrender to God all things, not just sexual addiction, but all things that I can't control, and so that I can live a meaningful, joyful life? It's out there. It's the opportunities out there for me, for anyone, I believe, who really desires it to be so. But this life offers some really incredible challenges for growth. And I'll say in my own case that had I not had this challenge with addiction, I think I would have missed out on a lot of opportunity to grow.
Oh yeah, and I believe that 100%, right? Because I've heard it so many times with my guests, right? It's happened even in my own life, right? Because I went 24 years at a job and then lost it because of a failed UA because I spent my weekend snorting cocaine and drinking, and here I thought my life was all hunky dory and great, not realizing really where I was at in my life. And I get out of my stuff, and then my ex-wife falls into her alcoholism, right? So it's like I got out of the closet and she walked in, and we're both on these totally different journeys. I'm on the journey of figuring out who I am. She's on the journey of I've had enough, right? And yeah, and this journey for both of our journeys have now put us on such a different path, and I'm actually grateful for it, in all honesty. And a lot of people who have come on my show have been actually grateful for their addiction. And I haven't shared this for a while. I was at an AA meeting with my wife one time, and this guy got up to get his 10 or 15-year chip. And he's first thing that came out of his mouth, he goes, I thank God every day for making me an alcoholic. And I remember leaning over to my wife and I said, that guy's effing crazy. I don't I don't understand. Why would he be grateful? And then as he went on to share his story, I finally started understanding. Now, however, I didn't understand fully, right? I didn't understand completely because I was still naive to addiction, thinking I knew everything there was about addiction when I didn't know crap about addiction. However, now I have a lot better understanding of what he meant by that because his life's so amazing today, right? And that's what he means because he feels his life wouldn't be where it's at today if it wasn't for his
Yeah,
downfall, right?
sure,
Yeah.
sure. And that I think that's common for those who have lived the pain of addiction, and there's a lot of pain with it, um, and the sorrow and the loss, and then discovering the joy that life really can be. But having done that, experience that joy by walking the pathway of recovery, by working the pathway of recovery, by developing the relationships with God, the relationship with God and with other people,
Yeah.
and then helping other people through their own struggles. If you look at the alcoholics and what they've done, basically, again, we go back step 12, helping another person is a very, very important part of this life in general. I mean, that's what God himself taught,
Yeah.
is that, that you're one of your one of your commandments and your whole purposes of living is to help somebody else. Well, what better opportunity is there to help somebody else that you've had experience with and you've made great progress in, to share your own experience and help them along their pathway? I mean, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
That's why we have to make ourselves known. And for a sexual addict, for a sex addict, that's not easy. You don't just stand around and say, I'm a sex addict, can I help you? I mean, but you look The alcoholics are in the early days, they were going into hospitals, they were looking for people who were in dire straits in regard to their sex or to their alcoholism, and they shared their story of recovery. Well, with a person that's dealing with unwanted sexual behavior and they identify as a sex addict, when we go to places and we identify that way, then it becomes more of a challenge to not have that a reflection of deviancy that's dangerous. And so the idea of deviancy that's dangerous, can I trust you around my children type thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a little bit tougher thing, but I can tell you that when my wife and I started the foundation, it's called SA Lifeline. You can go to salifeline.org. You can learn about how we are able to present a message of hope for recovery through the foundation. Go to sal12step.org and learn about our 12-step programs that are available in person and online. My wife has an incredible book. It's called What Can I Do About Me? It's called it's about her story of and journey of working through trauma, betrayal trauma. Both of our stories are in there. So we present we present ourselves now as living in recovery from sexual addiction and betrayal trauma. And because we have this foundation, we have to talk about our own story. So we do.
Yeah.
I mean, we had this is a rather interesting one. Um, I mean, it's been on the front page of newspapers, not because we were caught, but because we've come forward. And so, and what we've chosen to do. And it's been on TV the same way. So that's okay for appropriately to tell our stories. I don't advise people who have not worked recovery and lived recovery for a long period of time to be openly and generally open, just in a general sense, just announcing it to the world. You've got to be pretty careful there. But at the same time, we have to open our mouths to individuals that we know we can help, to people that are traveling in the circles of where in a with therapists or with clergy that are constantly in contact with people that are dealing with addiction, sexual addiction, trauma. They need to know where they can point those that they're serving to resources for help. So there are tons of resources. A person just needs to get some courage and avail themselves of those resources. And that courage starts with a willingness to be honest. And there's a ton of guys out there that are dealing with sexual addiction, that are dealing with porn problems. They just cannot be honest about it. The sad thing is they cannot recover on their own in isolation. They've got to come forward. They
Yeah.
can try, they can try, but they won't be successful in isolation.
I interviewed a Hollywood movie star. Matter of fact, how I got her, I was so shocked because it was my third episode of starting this show, and her name's Brianne Davis, and she started opening up about her love and sex addiction and how easy it was, right? When you're a Hollywood movie star, you got people who are willing to get you anything that you want, right? And she's like, I would have one foot in a relationship and one foot sleeping with whoever I wanted to sleep with, right? And she shared a lot of really good information on it, and exactly that's exactly what she's doing now, right? She's written a book about it. That's the name of her book, actually, is My Love and Sex Addiction, and she's out there helping a lot of other people and opening up. And I had a gal who used to come on my show as a guest co-host, and she actually came on the show once and shared her husband's sex and porn addiction. And he was actually going to come on the show with her, and he had just gotten a new job and wasn't able to ask for the time off. And uh, I remember she shared something with me that I'm pretty sure I was sitting there with my chin on the floor. Is she was asked by her bishop to do a talk at sacrament, and she says, well, what would you like me to talk about? And he says, well, talk about whatever God inspires you to talk about. So she thought about it, and the only thing that kept coming up was her talking about what has happened in her life, right, with her husband. And she's a wife who stuck by her husband as well while he was going through his battle. And so she got up in sacrament and shared what had happened in her life. And you said it, you got to be careful also how, some people how they react. And she says there was women that used to come out and talk to her all the time after sacrament. A lot of them stopped coming up and talking to her. However, there were others that never talked to her that came up and started speaking with her because they were going through the same thing. If it wasn't for her opening up, like you and your wife, Stephen, to open up, it takes people like yourself and other amazing individuals who come on this show to open up, because that's how we are helping others, right? I'm sure there is something that you've said during this show that there's going to be a listener or even a family member that's going, oh my gosh, somebody, so and so needs to hear this, because the ripple effect is probably bigger than what any of us know. You just threw the pebble in the pond right now, and all it is just a pebble. And if you threw that pebble and walked away, you wouldn't see how far that ripple goes. And it can go quite a way, especially if it's on a calm day, right?
Right.
So it takes a lot for individuals to step up to the plate and come out and talk about their addiction, whatever that addiction may be. Whether it is porn or sex or drinking or drugging or gambling or gaming or whatever it may be. Because as a lot of us know, the brain works the exact same way. It's that dopamine hit, and we're also covering up some things too that we just don't want to feel anymore, right? But however, as you stated, that guilt and that shame just keeps piling up. That ball starts getting heavier and heavier and heavier. Yeah. So, thank you for what you and your wife do, and thank you for starting, what is it, salifeline.org. Just think of the people that, gosh, you guys are saving, and you're doing God's work as far as I see it. That's just my version of it. You're doing God's work, because it's my wife told me once, I picked her up from a recovery center that she was there for 6 months, and she had stayed long enough where she had her 24-hour to where she could go leave for 24 hours, right? And she's going on about some stuff on some things. And of course, me being an addiction therapist, and a really crappy one at that, because I didn't know anything about addiction, I st- I started going on and started throwing my stuff out there, and she stopped me. And she says, I want to say something to you, and I don't want you to make a remark on it. But she goes, for once, and this is how she put it to me, for once, I wish you'd be my effing husband instead of my effing therapist, because you don't know anything about what I'm going through. And she was 100% right. 100% right. And you've said it a number of times throughout this episode, to be able to sit down with someone who has gone through it, it's much easier to talk to, right? Because they get what you're going through. For someone like your wife, when you first sat down and told her, she doesn't have a clue, right? Because I don't know if she told you as many times as I told my ex-wife, just stop, just stop. Because we think
Yeah.
it's that easy when it's really not. And it doesn't matter what the addiction is.
Yeah. Yes, that's exactly right. And the interesting thing is most people do stop. They just can't stay stopped.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a matter of, yeah, I stopped. Well, I just started again. That was my problem. So we learn how to not start again. And so that's what recovery really is. Well, I stopped. Yeah, I've stopped 1,000. I've stopped. How many days are there in a year? I've stopped 365 times, and I've acted out 365 times. But and so it's that I it's not about it's about this learning and recovery about how to stay stopped. And that stay stopped, and the alcoholics know it best, and that is surrender our will to God
Yeah.
and to the God of our understanding, who whatever that understanding is. And that's what's so cool about
Yeah.
it. We can talk about spiritual things in a discussion like this. We don't have to have one specific doctrinal discussion at all. It's the God of your understanding. It's the God of my understanding. Read, read. I think it's chapter 5, and is it chapter 5 or chapter 4? Alcoholics Anonymous. We agnostics is the title. And that chapter is like one of my favorite chapters in any book that's ever been written. And so the alcoholics say, and it was chapter 4 is we agnostics. Chapter 5, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. And then they say the only person that is going to fail is a person who can't be honest. And they say, so they're saying, join us, get
Yeah.
honest, come to the understanding of what your higher power is, and that to me is God. But I don't have to tell you to believe in the God that I understand. You just believe in the God that is yours, that you understand. And it's all different for us. But
Yeah.
you got to have a power higher than yourself, because how many times on your own, by yourself, have you tried to deal with this issue? Well, you're a great power because you haven't done jack
Yeah.
on your own.
Well,
So,
well put. Well put.
yeah.
I had a guest on my show a couple years ago and battled the same thing as you. Businessman, right? Traveled all the same stuff. And I remember him saying he was on a business trip at Boston and he remembers this bridge. And he's like, you know what? I can't beat this thing. I just can't beat it. And he knew about this bridge and he was going to jump off this bridge. He was going to commit suicide in a different state and just and he says he remembered saying a prayer before he was getting ready to jump. And he heard a voice say, "Why are you not celebrating the days that you haven't used?" And it stopped him. And he started thinking about it. And he goes, I'm sitting there by this bridge. I was just thinking about taking my life. And he goes, I'm beating myself up for the times that I use. Why am I not celebrating the days that I don't? So he said, instead of counting the days that he relapsed, he started counting the days that he didn't. And he went back to his hotel, called his wife, flew her there. And he said they sat in a hotel room and just sat there and talked and held each other and cried and prayed. And I think he's what, 15 years now or something like that. And you mentioned having that out of body experience, right? Where you were looking above and you're seeing the cops handcuff you and you're kind of feeling something different. So I what the big book says about having a higher power, whatever that higher power may be for you. I mean, I gotta have goosebumps on my arms. To me, that's something all of us need in our life, in all honesty, right? I don't think there's a one of us that can take control of our life and do it the proper way. Right. So
Right.
anyway, I just wanted to share that because that came up when you were talking about your business trips and things like that. Because yeah, his show just flashed through my head.
Well, it's, the cool thing about being in the circles of recovery are the stories. I mean, there's nothing more cool than to
Yeah.
hear people's stories.
And the
And I'll tell
journey,
you,
right?
yeah, their journey from where they were and where they are now. And then, if we could all do that, if we could all do that, if we all knew each other's stories, I can tell you it would be a world of love instead of a world of hate. When we really discover someone else's story, we we want the best for them. We want to help them. We want to empathize with them. We want to cry with them. We want to pray with them. And so it's when somebody is compromising the relationship by posing that we get this feeling like this just doesn't feel right. We all put off some kind of light. I don't know what it is. We put it off. We exhibit that light, and then others feel that light, whatever it is. And I don't know. I think there's something to that idea that there are ways of communicating are far beyond what we can see and what we can hear, what we can taste. When we're with somebody that is a really great person inside and they're honest, they're not a poser, I believe we know that. I believe we feel that.
Yeah.
So that And oftentimes in the rooms of recovery, we see those people and we feel those people and we're drawn to those people. And so we want to cheer. So in the meeting I was in this morning, 6:30 a.m., guy got his 1 year chip, sober from sexually acting. And he's a different man today. He's a friend. I've known him for some time. Got that chip and he had a lot to say. Basically, though, he said, I could never, ever have imagined 1 year ago, basically when I got caught, that today I could be rejoicing and feel so much joy and happiness. Could never have imagined. I've experienced the same thing myself. Could never have imagined. So need to go to, is it page 84 in the big book, the 12 promises, and read those 12 promises? Those 12 promises absolutely come true. One of them is we will not regret the past. And so those 12 promises, they say, are these extravagant promises? We think not. They've come to fruition, I'm paraphrasing, in the lives of a lot of us. So I think we just need to encourage people to experience the power and the joy of living free from the chains of addiction. But we have to want it. We got to more than want it. We got to do it. Got to be doers. Got to be doers, and then God can bless our efforts. Appreciate it, Al. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. One last question before we sign off here, Stephen. What does the other side of addiction mean to you?
The other side of addiction to me means that I can see the sunshine. I can feel the sunshine. I can see the beauty of the day. I can love my wife instead of lust after someone else. I can truly love her. I can have a willingness to give instead of take. So addiction, I think, is a very selfish behavior. Even though we may see ourselves as downtrodden, it's a very selfish behavior. Sexual addiction certainly is. So going from a selfish position or taking to a position of love and giving, recovery is love. Recovery is giving. Recovery is joy. So
Wow, well said. Thank you so
it's
much.
it's 1 day at a time, though, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's it.
It's
Stephen,
1 day at a time.
again, thank you so much for taking time out of your afternoon to be with us today, man. I just really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yep, my pleasure. Thank you for the invite.
Absolutely. Guys, thank you. Again, I say this all the time. Thank you to all our listeners, all our guests. Guys, none of this would be possible if it wasn't for you. You guys are the ones that's making it all happen. So I am grateful and appreciative. And remember this, addiction is giving up everything for one thing, and recovery is giving up one thing for everything. We're out.